Hey guys, what you're about to watch is an interview that I did with Melanie Radcliffe at the South Carolina Baptist Convention, talking about neighboring and reaching your neighbors with the gospel. This was a rather long interview, and so I've decided to break it into a couple different pieces. This first piece is going to focus on some of the biblical and theological principles behind neighboring. We hope you enjoy.
Yes. Hey guys, we want to welcome you to a special interview that we'll be doing with Miss Melanie Radcliffe from the South Carolina Baptist Convention. And we'll be talking together about neighboring and sharing the gospel with our neighbors. That is an emphasis that we really want to make this year at Fellowship Baptist Church. And Ms. Radcliffe has graciously come to share with us a little bit of information. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get into some neighboring stuff.
Sounds good. My name again is Melanie Ratcliffe, and I've been at the South Carolina Baptist Convention for about 11 years. I was part time for most of those years, but the past 3 years I've been full time. And I am married to a church planter. His name's Jody Ratcliffe, and we have three almost grown children 21, 19, and 17. And we served with the IMB, International Mission Board, for 3 years in Russia.
Nice.
And that's been, let's see, we came back in '08.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. I work primarily on the evangelism team at the convention,
Okay.
and I've been on that team for all of those 11 years.
Well, great, great. Uh, Before we get into, do you find that your experience being an international missionary, how's that affected how you've seen, or what have you learned from that experience as it comes to evangelism in an American context?
Actually, that's where I would say I learned to neighbor.
Okay.
God took me 6,000 miles away from West Columbia, where I was before,
Mhm.
to actually teach me how to make friends with people, lost people, in order to share the gospel with them, more like a relational evangelism type of thing. And it's just invaluable. It's exactly what I did there, I use here.
God does that sometimes. He
He
takes us through different things, and we don't even know where we're going. So,
Definitely.
let's start off with just a beginning opening question. What is neighboring? How would you define that?
That's a great question. I would say first, looking at a book called The Art of Neighboring, which I know you have read, and I don't know if anyone else in your congregation has read. Where the concept comes from is a couple of guys who are the authors of that book. They were meeting with other pastors, and they invited the city manager to come to their meeting to talk about neighboring and what that was like. And the city manager said something that stuck with them. And she said, well, from a city perspective, what non Christians do, like neighboring, is nothing different than what Christians do in neighboring, meaning they're not neighboring, they're not doing anything,
Yeah.
which really impacted them and should really impact us because what did Jesus tell us to do? He told us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so neighboring is that, loving our neighbors. And how do we do that? We do that through praying for them, caring for them, and sharing with them the good news of Jesus Christ within our sphere of influence. So it's not just neighboring is not just our immediate surrounding neighbors.
Mhm.
It encompasses those we do live around, but also those we live with,
Mhm.
meaning our families. I know I have those three that live with me, and you have kids of your own,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And a wife. And so those are people that we should pray for, care for, share with as well. But then also people at work. And then also people that we have fun with, our friends. And so that's what encompasses neighboring. And so I love to do an exercise. I would love for you guys at home to get a pen and paper. I have a little worksheet that you're welcome to use, Pastor, um, where you make a list of 5 people that you live with. So that would be your family. And then, yeah, he has it up here on the screen. And then make a list of 5 people that you live near which are your neighbors, 5 people that you work with, and then 5 people who are your friends. And then after you list those names, pause the video if you can. I want you to put a cross beside those names that you know for sure are saved. Those people are believers, they're going to heaven. And then put a question mark beside the names of the ones you just don't know. Or maybe you do know. Put a question mark beside those. And y'all, that is your mission field. One thing I learned when I went on the mission field was that wherever you are is where God has placed you to be on mission for Him. And so this is what we call your sphere of influence. This is where God has strategically placed you to be on mission for Him.
I think back to the Great Commission, in that word "go," which, if we look back at the original language, it's more of a participle, an ing word, and so it should be better going. So it's not. Sometimes I think, boil down evangelism to an event that we do, and there's nothing wrong with doing evangelism events, knocking on doors, things like that. But I think the Lord wants us to also see beyond just the event-based evangelism, and to see that on our goings, wherever we are, God has put intention. And this is a great piece of paper. You probably can't see it as well on the screen, but we're going to email that out to you, and you can print this off. We'll have it available on our website. It's a great little guide that just kind of says, do I know any lost people? Who are my neighbors? And this just gives you a quick guide to say, hey, here are all the people that many of us may not even know if they're believers, because we've never even had that conversation. So I think that's important. Sometimes we just maybe assume people are believers because they're decent, especially in the South.
That's true.
So I think this is a great tool.
I will
Sorry.
add one quick thing to that. After you finish that activity, I like for you to circle 3 of those names of people that you have a question mark beside.
Okay.
And that's where you start. Those are people that you begin to pray for God to give you opportunities. Also, if you, under your neighbors list, some people can't name 5 names under that. And so that's okay. That's okay. But that's also where you start, right?
Right.
That's a challenge for you to fill that list up and even go beyond to learn your neighbors' names.
Yeah, that's key. That's key. If you've noticed, even in how houses are made nowadays, it used to be that porches were made on the front, large front porches.
Yes.
And older houses, you still see that. You go into these older neighborhoods, they have that. And you have nothing on the back. Now we have these huge back porches and maybe a deck on the front, small. It's rare to see a large front porch,
Right.
because we become more privatized. I think it just shows the culture become more privatized. So how does neighboring fit with the Great Commission?
Exactly like you said about going. When we're called to be on mission and share the gospel with all the nations, some are called to go overseas, like my family was. We were called to go overseas. But it's so interesting. When we came back home, I felt called to be home as well.
Right.
And so what I love about that, the Great Commission, is you are called to be on mission wherever you are. There are all nations across the street from you. There are people surrounding you that are lost. There's 3.6 million people in our state that are far from God right now. That's 3 out of every 5 people that you know that are far from God. So the mission field is right in your front yard, literally. And so, for us to say, well, I can't go right now because of COVID, we can't go really overseas. Even the missionaries that are employed by the IMB are having difficulties getting overseas.
Right.
And so, I don't worry though, because I know in God's plan, that He had strategically placed me in my subdivision to be a missionary. There's 110 homes in my subdivision. And so that's the start. That's the starting point. So
that's great. That's a great way to see it and look at it. We use I use the term a lot here that God's called us to neighbors and nations, neighbors and nations. And I think that's the calling. And there are people, I think, that feel a calling to go and to leave where they're at. Maybe a younger person, a teenager that wants to explore the mission field in some way. But let's not forget that might be in the future, but God still has called us where we're at now. We know that God's called us where we're at right now because we're there, at least for the day. Maybe tomorrow it
Exactly.
changes, but at least for the day, God's called me here.
Well, and also in our IMB process to even become missionaries, we had to fill out tons of paperwork. Any missionary will tell you there's a lot of paperwork. But in that paperwork were very specific questions repeatedly asked. Who are you sharing the gospel with right now? Where is your mission field right now? And so the IMB wants you to be on mission before you go on mission.
Right.
And so that's a great practice for us today.
Good, good. Did God plan for me to live in my neighborhood?
That's a great question. I believe so. I believe that you were, again, strategically and intentionally placed where you live. And I grew up in Barnwell, so I grew up in a very, very small town in the country. Really, I had vegetables as my neighbors for a long time. So, but there were always people that I communicated with. We did have family that lived close on our land, but then I rode the bus with people around me. So, no matter what your context is, I lived in an apartment complex in Russia where I shared a door with, an elderly lady, and across the way was an architect. So, I do believe that God can place us where He wants us to be on mission. So,
Yeah, I think that's key is to just understanding in the sovereignty of God and the planning of God that there aren't really accidents. And that if He has put me in, I used to tell my students when I was a student minister that the desk they sit at during the school year is not an accident, and that maybe God has put you there because you're the only Christian that's around those 5 or 6 people around you. And I know we've chosen our careers, we've made plans, and all those things factor in. But we should recognize behind the scenes of all this is the hand of God intentionally placing us as missionaries to be salt and light wherever He goes. And that's key to realize that we don't just float through life. That what if I'm the only one they know that's a believer? And especially you say 3 out of 5 statistically, 3 out of 5 of your neighbors are going to be unbelievers. And of course, it matters where you're at and what business you're in. It may be higher than that. Obviously, that's just a broad statistic, but you can look at different areas for that. Who is my neighbor?
well, that's a great question. Of course, the Good Samaritan is a famous passage that you guys have probably gone over many, many times. When Jesus was asked that, who is my neighbor? Our neighbors we did that worksheet. We talked about your sphere of influence. That's who are your neighbors. But then you may even have someone cross your path, that uh, may not be someone you necessarily agree with or like, or even within your neighborhood, there may be someone you don't get along with. Are they your neighbor? I think Jesus would tell you, yes, they are your neighbor. And, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, key things to make sure you're doing. But I think reaching out to people who aren't like you is super important. And just like the Samaritan, and so it's honestly, you'll see the hand of God at work when you do that, and it's just such a beautiful thing.
Bringing up that Good Samaritan passage, obviously Jesus says that to provoke a little bit, to needle people, and basically saying, don't worry about who your neighbor is, you be a neighbor. There's a little bit of that. And I think what you said there was key. We live in such a divided world now. When I think the inclusion of social media has allowed us to form our own little bubbles of influence that have not, where it may have been invented to help us grow closer together with people, it's actually created more division because we can find our own little groups and get our own little sounding boards and usually get deeper and deeper into our own particular ways of seeing the world. And then everybody else is considered an outsider. And the church is called to cross those lines. And in a world that is so divided, what if the church really stood as a monument to the inclusion of people and the bringing together of people who don't have commonality? The only thing that they have common is the gospel, and that shows the power of the gospel. I think it's Paul in Ephesians 2 where he talks about he's taken these two men and made them into one, this Jew and Gentile who did not get along and they didn't eat together and had all these kind of cultural boundaries, and he's saying, no, you're one. And that shows the power of the gospel in that. And in a day and age where we are politically divided, there's racial tensions, there's all kind of things going on that would divide us. The church should stand as a beacon to say, something's different here. And I think that's key when we talk about who is our neighbor, not just who we get along with, not just who we're friendly towards, not who just thinks like us, but even the people, like you said, that don't think like us, and don't think like me, that don't support the same team, don't support the same political party or anything like that, that we're to be a neighbor to them. And they may never change and become Carolina fans and repent of their rebellious Clemson nature, but we can always pray for that. But ultimately, that doesn't divide us. So,
thank you for watching this portion of the interview with Melanie Radcliffe. Very thankful for her and all that she's done. Please join in for the other two sections, as they can be really helpful in understanding what it means to reach our neighbors with the gospel.